Hi, I'm Mrs. Dowglass, and thank you for joining us for our final session looking at how to learn philosophy through visual mapping. I'm very excited about this session because the philosopher that we're looking at, Boethius, is one of my favourite philosophers, 6th century, who did have quite a traumatic death. And I'm just going to welcome Julian, CEO of Endoxa, who created the app which we are learning to our session. Welcome, Julian. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks. I don't actually know how Boethius died, so you're going to have to tell us.
Well, according to the books that I've read, having been declared guilty of something he was totally innocent of, the death penalty was to have his head slowly crushed until it cracked like an egg. And
Goodness.
whilst he was on death row, 6th century death row, he writes this amazing philosophy book.
Oh, wow. Well, I hope that doesn't happen to us.
Yeah, me too. Julian, over to you.
Right, so I'm going to share the screen again. So let me just do this.
And you're going to take us through an amazing visual way of understanding Boethius's philosophical argument that he writes whilst he's on death row.
Yes, this one is really subtle. It's the most complex of the arguments that we've looked at in these videos. So I'm going to start obviously on the front page. This one, we could put it in philosophy or we could put it in religious studies. It would fit in both. It's currently in religious studies, theological and philosophical developments. And here it is. Boethius resolves the problem of God's justice.
Which is quite a big problem to resolve.
Yes. Well, it's blending two things. It's God's justice and the problem of free will.
And the problem of free will is absolutely fascinating. To what extent are we free? And how does that influence our responsibility or affect our responsibility for our own actions?
Yes, free will is a big problem. It's a huge part of metaphysics. But in this case, we're looking at one aspect of it, and that's its interaction with what are traditionally held to be the attributes of God. In particular, God is omniscient, God knows everything. And so the argument is quite simple. It's, okay, if God knows what we're going to do tomorrow, because he knows everything, we can't have free will. And in this argument, we go one step further and say, well, if we don't have free will, then then we can't be responsible for our actions. So it's unjust of God to punish us.
Fascinating.
Okay, so I'll start here. There's a little bit of introduction here on the bottom left, as usual. Actually, 2 steps worth of it. So we're going to look at the argument that because God is all-knowing, omniscient, he has no right to punish us. And then we'll look at the counter-argument proposed by Boethius. And then lastly, we'll look at a little bit of criticism of Boethius.
And I like the fact that the green flashing next sign kind of flashes away to remind us that we click on that.
Yes, we have tried to put in 1 or 2 features to show you what to do next. So we're going to start this one off in the obvious place, which is God is omniscient. So God knows everything. This is traditionally meant to be one of the characteristics of God, along with God is omnipotent, so he can do anything. You can think of the rest of them probably better than I can.
And because this is our 4th video, our students know that we go from the statement God is omniscient to the statement that God knows the choices that we will make in the future, and that the box in the middle is telling us what type of argument step that is.
Yeah, this is a simple entailment. So if God is omniscient, knows everything, the choices that we will make in the future are one of the things that he can know. It's a thing that is knowable. So this is a direct entailment. So if this is true, this is definitely true.
And you've said previously that another way of understanding that is an entailment argument is kind of a common sense argument.
Yes, entailment argument is if I drove my car to work this morning, my car must have been working this morning. It's that kind of thing. Maybe this is a bit more philosophical, I guess. God is omniscient, but all we're saying is that if God knows all things, and one of those things is what we do in the future, then he must know that as well.
And of course, can God drive a car is a completely different philosophical debate.
Yes, we're not going to get into that one today, happily. So I'll go on to the second step. There we go. So if God knows what we do in the future, if anyone knows what we do in the future, then it happens of necessity. And we need to just unpack the word necessity. This is a good philosophical word. What happens necessarily can't happen any other way. So there's possibility and there's necessity. And necessity can't happen another way. So God knows what we'll do in the future. And so this is a clear implication argument. It's an if-then argument. That means that everything we do happens of necessity. I'll just click on the box there. And we've just got a little bit of further explanation. If something happens of necessity, it could not have happened otherwise. This means everything we have done or will do could only have happened how it did or will do.
So maybe another way of saying that is, if that is the case, if this is the case, then that is the case.
Yes, so an implication argument needs an if-then premise, and a premise saying that the if is true, and then you get the then is true. Yeah.
So if I'm recording this now, then it is taking place.
Yes, that would be a good philosophical one there. This is simply the idea that if God knows what we're going to do tomorrow, then it can't happen otherwise than what he knows.
Thank you.
So this goes directly to the next step. If everything can only happen one way, the way it actually happens or will happen, then we have no free will. Free will is the idea that we can change, we have some effect on how things happen. But if things could not have happened another way, we don't have free will.
And what happens when we click the brain at the top?
That brain, I've just shown that gives you extra information about that statement, which I've just opened. And the question mark gives you more information about the step. So it'll explain the step in words, and it'll give you what are called critical questions, which are ways in which that argument could be supported or undermined.
And I know the brain facility is available in all of the arguments, but particularly and slightly darkly apt in the case of Boethius.
Yes, now you've told me how he met his end. That is a bit darkly apt, I agree. So I'll go to the next step. You could finish the argument here that we have no free will, because for most people that's quite an objectionable conclusion. Actually, in this case, we take 2 more steps to derive some further conclusions. So if we don't have free will, we don't have a responsibility for our actions, because we can't choose them. They're going to happen the way they happen, whatever we do. That means, so clearly this is another implication argument, we have no responsibility. I mean, I should point out here again that red means false and blue means true. And also these argument steps, if they have a red arrow, that's called a con argument. That's making its conclusion false. If they have a blue arrow, they are making the conclusion true. That's called a pro argument. And each step its premises are black, and its the arrow that goes to the conclusion is either blue or red.
Great. And just briefly remind us what a premise is.
The premise is the starting point of an argument step. So we've got two steps here. This is the premise of this step. This is the conclusion of the first step, which becomes a premise of the second step. So there are two premises to this step and one conclusion. And the arguments form chains like this.
So almost it's the bits that lie behind the key points in the argument.
Yes, we're using the word premise quite precisely. Premise often gets misused as a word. So a premise is a statement that is required for the argument step to work. The conclusion is what you get out of the argument step. And an evidence statement is a statement that's not required by the argument, but it can modify its strength.
So these visual maps are arguing at quite a high level.
Yeah, I mean, what we're doing here right now, I mean, Boethius is not easy. This is, it is in A level, of course, but I mean, this is degree level. And actually what we looked at in the second video with Paley, that's for sure degree level philosophy.
Which is exciting.
Yes, and indeed, we want to roll this out to universities after we've done it with schools. So I'm going to go.
Where to next?
Right. So there's one more step to add to get to the conclusion that Boethius doesn't want. So if we have no responsibility for our actions, punishment without responsibility is unjust. You can't punish people who have no control over what they're doing. So God has no right to punish us for anything that we do. And that's a conclusion that most theologians would wish to argue against. And it all comes back to this problem of not having free will, because everything we do happens of necessity. So that's the background to what Boethius was arguing against.
And it's clearly laid out in the argument map, and students can go back to this afterwards and have a play around with it themselves.
Exactly. They just need to log in and do exactly what we're doing here. So I'm going to go on and actually start talking about Boethius now. So he, there's some guidance notes here, which I guess we're going to just talk over. So as you said, he's a 6th century philosopher, and he wanted to argue that despite God knowing what we're going to do tomorrow, we still have free will. And the idea he comes up with is that God is not in time in the same way that we are. And if I just go forwards one step, we can make this very concrete. This is his premise, that God experiences time differently from us. God sees all past and future actions in one glance, so as a simultaneous present. So past and future actions in the world, everything that humans are doing or anything else, at the same time. So God's eternity is a simultaneous present.
So almost as if God had in front of him an infinite number of TV screens with every moment of time from past, present, and future visible.
Yes, exactly. So experiencing something that we can only experience through time in one simultaneous moment. It's the best analogy I've heard is one from Douglas Hofstadter, who said, imagine taking a record, an old-fashioned LP, and you put it on a record player and you listen to it one note at a time. But imagine you could press it against your skin and feel the music all in one moment. What would that be like? Well, we can't do that. That's not something humans can do. but it's kind of what God is doing with his view of the world.
What a great analogy.
Yeah, I like that one. It's in one of Hofstadter's very philosophical books. So I'm just going to click on the brain here and show you. We've got some original quotes from Boethius here that you could pick up and put in an essay if that's useful. I've done that in a couple of places. But Boethius is definitely available for free online. It's that's in the Gutenberg.org project.
And in fact, the link to that will be on Firefly.
Yeah. So now Boethius's argument is really quite subtle. And we've modeled it here as in two analogy steps. And we're going to go through this and just talk through this in some detail. There's quite a lot of explanation on the left-hand side here. That's because it is quite a difficult argument to grasp. So the first thing is he comes up with a little thought experiment. It's very simple. So imagine you're standing at a window looking out at the sun rising, and at the same time you can see a person who's walking along outside. So you can see at the same time you see the sunrise and you see a person walking. So that's the situation. This is inside our scenario box. So that's the context for the logic that's inside. And we already have our premise that God sees the past and the future as a simultaneous present. And what Boethius is doing is making an analogy between God seeing things and you standing by the window and watching what's outside. So you see the person walking and you see the sunrise in one glance in your present. God sees that as well, but he sees all past and future actions in his simultaneous present. And you, when you're looking outside, you know that the sunrise is something that's necessary. It's a physical necessity. The sunrise has to happen. Whereas the man walking chose to walk. You can see that, you grasp it, and therefore you know it. And in the same way, God grasps the same thing of the things he sees. He sees which future actions or past actions are necessary or which are voluntary. You have to sit and think about this for a bit to imagine this analogy, I think.
So one of them involves a person's free will and the other one doesn't.
Yeah, so the sunrise there's no freedom about it. It's just the laws of physics working. It's physically necessary. And the person walking is a voluntary action. It's an action from free will. If I just click on the question mark a sec, sometimes if you don't understand something, go and read the version in words. So in this case, I see a human walking in the sunrise in one glance in my present. I understand that the sunrise is necessary and the human walking is voluntary. Similarly, God sees all past and future actions in one glance in the simultaneous present, and God understands which future actions are necessary or voluntary. And it may be easier for you to read that and understand they're both available to understand the logic.
And I think these pop-up boxes are so useful for students to be able to access this independently.
Yeah, and just to point out one other thing is that there's more help here. If you click here, you'll get a video explaining how analogy works. And I mean, analogy is two things are the same in one way, so therefore they're probably the same in the other way. And they're tricky arguments. You can easily get them wrong. So if I say this car is red and it goes fast, that car's also red, so it probably also goes fast. That's a bad analogy because the color doesn't have anything to do with whether the car goes fast or not.
Interesting. In some ways, I'm like a world-class football player, and in some ways, I am not.
Yes, I think I could say the same. Okay, I'm going to go to the next step. Right. This is the second analogy step. So there are two linked analogies here, or analogy argument steps. Now I'm going to use two of the statements that were in the first analogy step. You can see the first step is here. Two of them drop down and get used again in this second step. So I know the sunrise is necessary and the walking is voluntary, and God knows for all actions, past and future, whether they're necessary or voluntary. Now, my knowing, this is the crucial part, my knowing that the man is walking does not make his walking necessary. That's kind of obvious. It's almost so obvious it's stupid. Looking out of the window and seeing that the man is walking doesn't mean the man had to walk. And you can say the same thing about God. God looking at people, even though they're in the future or the past, and seeing what they're doing, doesn't make those things necessary in just the same way as you looking out of the window doesn't make anything necessary.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's quite a stretch. It's a very imaginative argument. He actually goes a little bit further. So he decides to support this argument further by adding, we've put it in here as an evidence statement, this one, where he makes a distinction between two kinds of necessity. So if people argue back, but I mean, if God sees it, if it's necessary, if God sees it, it's necessary. He distinguishes two senses of necessary. One is if you see something happening, then you know it happens, and if you know it, it's definitely true. It's necessarily true. That's a property of knowledge. You can only know things that are actually true. But your knowing that in the present didn't make it necessary in the sense that the person had to be walking. So he calls one sense conditional necessity and the other sense simple necessity. So the watching the man walking is a conditional necessity, but it didn't make his walking necessary like the sun coming up was necessary.
So in conditional necessity, free will is involved.
Yes, you can have conditional necessity of something, but it's still a free will action.
Great, thank you.
And this helps you understand how this can be true. So the conclusion of this is God's knowing about future voluntary actions does not make them necessary, because they're only necessary in this conditional sense.
Great. And where does the
rest of it? Sorry?
Where does the argument go next?
Yeah, okay. The rest of it is actually quite simple, because having derived this, you can use it directly to undermine the argument we had at the beginning. So this argument that arrives that everything we do happens of necessity, one of the critical questions here is, are there any exceptions to God's foreknowledge implying necessity? Oh, sorry, foreknowledge in general implying necessity. And well, we've just shown that. That was the point of Boethius' argument, that God's foreknowledge, his knowing about future voluntary actions, does not make them necessary, because they're only conditionally necessary, because he sees them in his eternal present. And if that's not true, this argument is wiped out. And that means we can go back to thinking as we normally do, that we have free will. And if that's true, then the other two steps of the argument we saw before fall away.
I think most of us are very happy to be left with free will and not have that taken away from us.
Yes, it's hard to imagine how we can't have free will. The last two steps is just a little bit of criticism. So here's an expert opinion argument step. You can always stick these into an argument. If you've got some kind of author that you want to quote, this is one way to get it into the argument. So here we've got Anthony Kenny, who's a philosopher, said that this idea of God's foreknowledge is just incoherent. If that's true, that's definitely a con argument against the idea of the simultaneous present. So this makes this statement incoherent. It's conflicted because basically Boethius is saying it's true and Kenny is saying it is not true. And Kenny gives an example. How can God see the rise and fall of Rome at once?
He needs to know about the infinite TV screens.
Exactly. And so now we have a criticism of the criticism. Of course, philosophy, you can go through as many steps as you like in this. So another philosopher, Kotobinsky, says, no, Kenny is judging God by finite human standards. It's true of a human. A human can't see Rome rise and fall at the same time, but God can, even if they're on an infinite variety of TV screens.
And the red broken line is telling us that that box is disagreeing with the expert opinion.
Yeah, so this blue broken line is the support for Kenny, and this red broken line is the undermining evidence, and that takes away this purple bar that represents the strength of the argument.
And this is naturally leading us into really good evaluation.
Exactly. The evaluation is done. There's within the computer program, it's running, it's effectively calculating with truth through all these statements and argument steps. So you can see here, without doing anything further, this is not conflicted anymore, because this argument that was making it partly red and partly blue has gone away. So now it's totally blue. Kenny's opinion has been dealt with, and we're back to Boethius's assertion.
Great, thank you.
So the last step is, as ever, the complete graph, so you can see how everything fits together.
And as students are editing their own graphs, they can add any number of expert opinions?
Yeah, they can add what they like. So here is the whole graph. There's the argument you started with, the argument that says God has no right to punish us. Here's Boethius's sunrise argument, and here's the criticism we added at the end. There's a lot more you could add to this, and there's lots of authors, I think, have commented on this. So you have your choice. You can edit it pressing here, or you can go back to the lesson menu and have a look at something else.
So students can do their own further reading on this and just keep on expanding it.
Yes, and then, I mean, if they have an essay to write, for example, they can do their reading and then summarize the arguments all in one place and save it as their own argument graph, and then use that as a visual map to plan. It's the essay plan, in fact.
Which is a brilliant resource to have.
Yeah.
And Julian, where do you suggest our students go from here?
Well, they can go they can log into the app and they can look at any of these lessons. We've got politics has a lot, and we're building up geography, religious studies, and business at the moment. And the rest of the subjects, we have some demo arguments in. There's also this section here on training, where we've got training lessons. And I'll mention yet again that we have live chat to ask questions, and we have a help and guide section that opens another tab with all the help videos.
Fabulous, as well as the live chat option, which is within Endoxa itself, which is amazing. There's also GDSD support too. Julian, thank you so much. That has been fascinating. And we're really excited about using visual mapping to learn philosophy.
Well, definitely keep in touch and tell me how people get on. And if people either click the live chat or they submit a graph, so they make an edit to a graph and then hit submit, then we will talk to them directly and give them feedback and help with it.
Great, and we're really excited to be using an app to learn, which is the world first.
Yes, it definitely is. Nobody has done this before. Not anything like this.
Great. Okay, thank you very much, Julian.
Right, bye. See you.